So one day I said to myself, Flora, you know, before you get too old and forgetful, you better sit down and write a book about how things used to be. So I did. Oh, it's not in your library, so don't run out to look for it. And it's not for sale. In fact, there's only one copy, and this is it. But I'd sure like to read it to you. I'd like to introduce you to some of the hardest souls that settled around here, share a funny story or two, and I'll just give you a little history lesson about how this place used to be and how the place is that all of us call home. The story begins like this. Once upon a time, because all good stories should begin that way, my name was Flora Frazier, and I was 9 years old. I lived with my mother and my father, my sister Meadabelle, and my younger brother Frank in North Florida. Now, my father had come down here first. He liked what he saw, and he paced out his homestead, 160 acres right along the shores of the beautiful St. Lucie River. Then he came back home to tell my mother what he had done and to ask her if she might want to go back with him. Well, she just smiled and she said, Russell, wherever you go, I will go. Well, he said, we better ask the children if they'd like to go. And they did. And we said, Mama, Papa, wherever you go, we will go. And so the Frazier family embarked on an adventure that would last the rest of their lives. My father hired a sailing barge, the biggest, flattest boat I'd ever seen. Well, it had to be. It carried all of our belongings, our household goods, all the lumber from our old torn-down ice house, which would later be used to build a shelter for us. Well, that is until our new house was built. There was also a horse and a wagon aboard, a dog and a cat, 40 chickens, and 3 beehives, the first beehives ever to float down the Indian River. Well, after it was all loaded, our family of 5 came aboard. Now, the ship ran pretty well after a big rainstorm, but if the water was low, it had all it could do to get down the Indian River. It was aground most of the time on the sandbars and the oyster bays. It took us 8 days to go from Titusville and 8 long nights. There weren't a great deal of mosquitoes, however. The first time and the last time we ever thought about it. I mean, they just weren't around. We spent most of the nights, as I said, aground. Then in the morning we had to pry, lift, push, and pray, and in true Florida fashion, wait for the tide to rise before we could go on. We arrived on the St. Lucie River on August 12th, 1887, right at the mouth of a creek that was later to be called Frazier Creek. My father was right. Oh, that river was the most beautiful sight we had ever seen, and we were all so excited. Well, that is until our possessions were put out on the creek bank, leaving us high and dry while the boat sailed away. Then Mr. Willis Bessie came along. He had seen the boat arrive and wanted to welcome us and offer his help, which was greatly appreciated. But it wasn't too long before we began to meet our other neighbors. Mosquitoes the size of horseflies, and snakes, and assorted critters hiding in the underbrush. And the rivers and the creeks were filled with alligators. I can remember waking up in the morning and hearing their roar. Then other alligators would begin to answer them, and well, it like to scared us half to death. But in spite of the gators, and in spite of the bugs and the mosquitoes and everything else, the creeks and the rivers were absolutely beautiful. Frazier Creek was full of yellow water lilies. The skies would darken with the ducks who came by the thousands to feed on the seeds of those lilies. And Poppleton Creek, Well, it was filled with white lilies, and Bessie Creek with yellow lotus. The rivers were so clean you could see right down to the bottom, and the fish so plentiful that if you were quick enough, you could grab one with your hands. Sea trout, and pompano, and snook, and snapper. And there were tasty oysters, and all the big fat mullets you wanted you could catch with a cast net or a spear. Oh, I recall once that my young son Harry caught a flounder with an old umbrella. It only had its ribs. And if you wanted to and you were lazy enough, you could leave a lantern burning in a tethered rowboat overnight, and half dozen mullets would jump in, ready to be picked up off the boat bottom the next morning. We had plenty of meat to eat. We had venison and rabbit and squirrels and manatees. Oh, I tell you, every time I visit with folks here on my porch, they always say, "What does manatee taste like?" Well, I'm going to tell you. Some people say it's rather salty. It never bothered me much. To me, it tasted more like roast pork. It was very tasty. In fact, when we later on had beef, we were just as content to have the manatee. It was just as good. Now, if we needed other supplies, my father would sail up to Cantown. They changed the name to Fort Pierce a long time ago, but it was called Cantown because that's where everyone took their pineapples to be canned and what have you. Well, they changed the name, as I said, a long time ago, but it was still a 3-day trip up there, no matter what it was called. That's if the winds were fair. So if it wasn't necessary that we go, why, we would just wait for Captain Walter Kitching and his trade boat to come along. He called his boat the Merchant. And you knew he was coming when you'd hear him blow his conch horn. He'd come around, about once a month, floating his general store up and down the rivers, carrying everything, from food and clothing to medicine and building supplies. In those days, in order to get anywhere, or do anything, like, visit a neighbor, or maybe ship your pineapples, or buy your supplies, it had to be done by boat. That was the only transportation. At one time, there was a church boat, and there was a dental boat. And if you were sick or having a baby, you'd have to have someone cross the St. Lucie, pick up Dr. Haney on the north side of the North Shore, row him back across, and hope and pray that the baby would wait to be born or the patient didn't die. Even the ride to the grave was by boat. Fern Hill Cemetery was located just where it is now, right next to Poppleton Creek. In order to cross the river to get to school, you had to take a school boat, not a school bus. Of course, that was after our one-room schoolhouse was built in 1889. Before that, we didn't even go to school. But our mom and papa insisted that even if we didn't go, we had to do our lessons. And then we had to do our chores. And then we had to help our father at our pinery. You see, the soil down here was just perfect for raising pineapples. And my papa, and most of the other settlers for that matter, had come here for that exact purpose, to raise pineapples. Our 160-acre homestead was located in what is now a very large portion of central Stuart. My father cleared 160 acres with his own hands. And then he set out to raise pineapples. You know, every time I am on Colorado Avenue, I have to smile. And it's a big smile. Because you see, that was the very path that ran smack dab right through our pineapple fields. And the path my father named Flora Avenue. It was named after my sister Meter Bell and me. Flora was also the name of our pinery. And when my father gave the land for the first school to be built here in Stuart, not the little one-room schoolhouse. It had to be bigger because by that time there were at least, 30, 40 children. It was with the stipulation that it had to be called Flora School. Now, the original Bellflower School was a wooden building, and it was torn down many years ago. But it was replaced with a concrete school. And in those days, they made concrete blocks. My brother Frank actually manufactured them, but they could only make 2 at a time. So it took a little while to build the building. Now, if you're interested in seeing those bricks, you can go into the small, well, oh, I forgot to tell you. Later on, after the school, we outgrew the school and had to be a bigger one even than that, they put an addition onto it, and it became the Martin County Courthouse. But as far as the Bellflowers, well, they're all gone now. But the bricks still remain in the men's restroom in the small courthouse. So if you're interested in seeing those bricks, I'd suggest you go into the men's restroom, or send your husbands. Well, they're all gone now, as I said, the Bellflowers. So many things have changed down here. Well, I remember when we arrived, there wasn't even a Martin County. In fact, Dade and Brevard were the only 2 counties on Florida's entire east coast. And where was the county line? I bet you don't know. It was right smack dab at the St. Lucie River. So we were far away from everything. We were the stepchildren. Of course, this was all before the railroad came down. Once it did, things really began to change. Now, the railroad had built a station on the north side of the river in the little town of Goslingville, which meant goose, little goose, or Wawa, as the Seminoles used to call it. And they called the flag stop of the station Stuart. Our little settlement lying on the south side was a flag stop known as Potsdam. Now, there's a story that's been going around for years about the name of Potsdam. Some folks say it's true, others say it's not. I'll just let you decide for yourselves. As time went on, more and more people began to hear about this wonderful place called Potsdam. It had wonderful fishing and beautiful weather, so they decided that they would come down by train to see for themselves. Well, the train conductors thought the name of Potsdam was a joke. So when they'd pull into the station, they'd call out, Potsdam, 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 Potsdam. Well, until it came out, damn Pots, damn Pots, damn Pots. Well, it confused the passengers and offended many a lady traveler, I'll have you know. In 1895, the railroad authorities moved the Stuart Depot to the south side of the river, and with it came the name Stuart. We didn't want to be called Goslingville, you know, little goose. But we didn't incorporate until 1914. By that time, the young town of Stuart was no longer in Dade County. It was now in the newly formed county of Palm Beach. I had 5 children. All 5 of them, I mean, they were all born in 3 different counties, and they never left home. Stuart was named, by the way, after a very likable young man named Homer Hines Stuart, who homesteaded on the north shore of the river. Homer was quite friendly with all of the settlers, and everyone liked him, both on the north and south shores of the river. You could usually see a sailboat or a rowboat heading over to the house, because whenever the settlers wanted to relax and enjoy themselves and maybe have a glass of sarsaparilla or something of that order, one of them would say, well, let's go see Stuart. But Stuart didn't stay around here very long. His wife-to-be didn't like snakes or bugs or alligators, so he went back home. But he left us a wonderful legacy, Stuart. Now, Martin County was named in 1924 after Governor John W. Martin, who said in his campaign speech, "I remember my friends, and I never forget my enemies," which, by the way, was a very good thing for us, because as governor, he helped pave the way for our new county, which he knew was going to be named in his honor. I remember it like it was yesterday when we celebrated the county's first birthday. Oh, what a celebration that was. There was a grand parade of floats and marching bands and over 700 decorated automobiles. And the town was decked out in red and white and blue bunting, and the flags were flying everywhere, and everyone was there. Everybody. Friends and family, and oh, you know, there was such a kinship in our community in those days. And every once in a while you find it again today, but it was everywhere then, everywhere. Of course, a lot of us married, you know, into other families, so we were really kin in more ways than one. We were just one big happy family. We'd have all-day picnics at the seashore. Word would spread quickly when a picnic was planned, and everybody would bring their own food, and then we'd sail to the ocean, and if we wanted to dance on the sand, there was always someone in the crowd who could play a fiddle. Why, we even held dances in pineapple sheds. There was always something going on at church. Of course, everybody went to church on Sunday, and then afterwards we'd, you know, visit in each other's homes. And once a year, everybody went to the Palm Beach County Fair. Most of us went by boat because there was only a rock road between Stuart and West Palm Beach at that time. It was a long trip. Oh my, was it long. But it was worth it. Oh, worth every moment. And some of us liked music so much that we organized the Mozart Musical Club. I had taken piano lessons when I was young, and occasionally we'd gather around our piano in our house, and I'd play the few songs that I knew. My children said that if I played Grandfather Clock one more time, they'd tie my hands together because I didn't know too many tunes. And if there was a silent moving picture down at the Lyric, you can bet you'd see our whole family there. My little daughter, my youngest daughter, Virginia, learned to read at the Lyric Theater, watching those words go by. That's how she did. And my secret desire was someday to accompany those pictures on the piano, but that was Mrs. Hancock's job. They owned the Lyric, so I guess my desire will never come to fruition as long as she's around. Oh, and before I forget, I do want to tell you about another exciting time, and it was, well, it was the biggest thing that ever happened around here. It was the great big fire in downtown Stuart. Now, it was on New Year's Day in 1916. The drugstore, some houses, and a church all burned down on the very same day. Yeah, I can see that so what expression on your faces. Well, let me tell you, maybe it wasn't Chicago, or maybe it wasn't the San Francisco fire, but let me tell you, it was a catastrophe. Now, it was on the day of the annual Big Palm City picnic, which at that time was the social event of the year. Half the people from Stuart had already gone over on the ferry. You knew there was a ferry that went back and forth twice a day. Some came in their own boats, but everybody came to eat and to visit and to have a good time when somebody started yelling, and I don't remember who, "Stuart is burning down! Stuart is burning down!" Well, everybody started running around like chickens with their heads cut off. We knew that if we could see that smoke billowing all the way over to Palm City, that it had to be a pretty big fire. Well, all the able-bodied men and a few kids piled into their boats and onto the ferry, and they rushed down the river. Well, there were a handful of brave women and children who had been battling the fire for over an hour. Now, if it hadn't been for them, the whole town would have burned down, and we wouldn't be sitting here tonight. They managed to save some houses, but they couldn't save the Methodist Church. You know, that's like saying Rome was saved, but the Vatican burned down. It started in Geiger's drugstore. The place was full of chemicals anyway, and they kept exploding. It looked like fireworks, red, green, blue, like the 4th of July on New Year's Day. Somebody started yelling, "Go get the hand pumper." Well, the hand pumper was the only fire engine that Stuart had in those days. And then they were hollering for the fire chief. They couldn't find him, and screaming for the volunteer firemen. And most of them were still over in Palm City having a good time at the picnic. Well, would you believe this? They discovered that the pumper was locked in a shed, and nobody knew where the fire chief was. Well, they later found him. He had been drinking a little heavily and was sleeping out his, whatever. Well, he had the key to the padlock. So they got an axe and they broke down the door. Well, the pumper was nothing more than a big barrel full of water with a pump on the top. And so they started pumping away, squirting water through the windows of the drugstore, and then all of a sudden the pumper ran dry. So then folks were sent to get every bucket they could find, and they organized a bucket brigade, mostly women and children, again, passing the buckets from hand to hand. Well, they finally put the fire out, but not before it caused a great deal of damage, as well as a great deal of excitement, especially for the young boys, the boys around town. Oh, the young children, all of them, but mostly the boys. Young Ernie Lyons, any of you remember young Ernie Lyons? You should know him. He was a very bright 10-year-old in those days. He came back to the picnic full of spit and vinegar, telling everybody who'd listen how he'd saved 22 chickens. And when he threw open you know how he did it? He threw open the door of J.B. McDonald's chicken yard and saw where his flock was threatened with being roasted prematurely, so he freed those chickens. Well, in those days, chickens were very important. Everyone had chickens. You couldn't go to the store and buy eggs or chickens all defeathered and dissected and ready for the pan. You had to get your own chickens from under the hens in the hen house. And you had to wring the necks of the young friars and watch the headless wonders jump around the backyard before you scalded them and plucked their feathers and took out their innards. I always saved the hearts and gizzards and livers for giblets. I don't know what other people did. Anyway, I was really proud of Ernie for saving the birds, but they did add to the confusion of the bucket brigade, running around, squawking and getting in everyone's way. You know, chickens aren't very smart. They're so dumb, they run in front of automobiles. What few automobiles we had in Stuart in those days. We only had 2 in Stuart, actually. And one day they ran into each other. Head on. Totaled both of them. But thank goodness no one was hurt. And then there weren't any more cars in Stuart for a while. And sometimes I wish that it was still the same way. But we did have trains. I used to love to go down to the train station. It was one of the best places in town to visit and socialize. And it provided a great deal of entertainment. I mean, just watching people jumping up and down with using their skeeter switches, doing a St. Vitus dance, anything to keep those pesky mosquitoes from biting. Oh, and if the train happened to arrive, well, that just added to the excitement. Oh, and speaking of excitement, I was there the day Morris John's monkey, Jocko, got fresh with Mrs. C.S.B. Haney. Now, Cynthia Haney was a very prim and proper lady. And Jocko, well, you know, he often got loose, but he usually didn't cause too much trouble until one fine Florida day when he did. First, he scared a young boy and caused him to fall off his bicycle. I was standing right across the street. I saw, though, exactly what happened. Well, as that boy picked himself up, I happened to look over and noticed that Jocko was eyeing Mrs. Haney, who was standing on the corner talking loudly to an elderly gentleman. Mrs. Haney was hard of hearing, you know. Well, Jocko got so excited that he ran into a lady carrying a load of wash on top of a head, and that caused even more excitement. Well, through this whole episode, Mrs. Haney hadn't even noticed Jocko. Well, let me tell you, Jocko was not the type to be ignored. So he decided to let Mrs. Haney know he was there. And he just snuck up behind her and pinched her in a very inappropriate spot. She let out a scream, like to scare us all to death, especially Jocko. He jumped up on top of a roof, and it took the volunteer fireman nearly an hour to get him down. And after all that excitement, that young boy pedaled off on his bicycle to see what the rest of Stuart was doing. Now, I asked you if you knew Ernie Lyons. Well, that boy was Ernie Lyons again. He's all grown up now, you know. And Ed Beniger over at the Stuart News recently hired him as a reporter. Oh, I'm sure he'll be around. He'll be around for a long time, seeing what the rest of Stuart is doing, seeing what the rest of Martin County, for that matter, is doing. Now, if you haven't been around here for a long time, you probably don't know how certain creeks and rivers and streets or whatever got their names. Well, mostly from our early settlers. Bessie Creek was named for the Bessie brothers. Mr. Bessie was one of the Bessie brothers, was the first to come down, Hubert, and he settled on the banks of the South Fork of the river. Jensen Beach was named for John Jensen, who came here for Denmark to homestead, and he landed on the west shore of the Indian River and built himself a town. Kruger Creek was named for the Krugers. Bert was the son. He was the first pilot in our area. He had a lot to do with the first Stuart Airport. George W. Parks. Well, Mr. Parks built that wonderful Stuart feed store. It's still there right downtown. You can go in and look around. I mean, you can buy things in there you cannot buy anywhere else in the world, and find even more things that you can look at and have a good time and dream that you might want to own someday. Poppleton Creek was named for Colonel O.O. Poppleton. Now, he was one of the world's leading authority on bees. Sewell's Point was named for Henry Sewell. Haney Creek was named for Dr. Haney. Now, Dr. Horace Haney tended our medical needs when he was sober. Now, this is a rather sad story. I don't want any of you to cry. The doctor had married a spinster who had recently moved to Stuart. After they married, her name was Mrs. C.S.B. Haney. That's right, the very same Mrs. Haney that got pinched by Jocko. Now, Mrs. Haney was a suffragist. You getting the picture? She could have been Carrie A. Nation had she had a hatchet. She was a woman who found solace in working to improve the lives of the downtrodden, especially women and children. She was a lecturer and organizer for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and had been assigned to Florida to establish the WCTU chapters throughout the state, and decided to make her home here in Stuart. She stood for everything the doctor made fun of: cleanliness, charity, perfection, love, and above all, she had a tremendous dislike for alcohol. But you know what they say: the bigger they are, the harder they fall. The doctor took one look at Cynthia S. Burnett, 57 years old, mind you, and became twitterpated. The next thing you knew, they were married. And then they got a divorce 5 years later. Oh, it's not surprising. Dr. Haney had an addiction to the very substances that his wife was so against. She did keep her married name. We never could figure out why, but she did. And became a pillar of our community. Everybody adored her. And on her 80th birthday, the people of Stuart dedicated a traffic circle right downtown. Haney Circle. I bet you've been around that a time or two. And later on, if you come up, I'll tell you another story about Haney Circle and that beautiful, well, maybe I'll tell it to you right now. When you go around that circle, do you see that beautiful statue? Well, that statue had been cast in France many years ago, and it was to be used actually at the World's Fair, New York's World's Fair in 1938. Well, something happened, you know, the war and everything. It ended up somewhere until the Women's Club right here in Stuart found out about it and thought they would buy it, and they did for $2,000. Now, they put it behind, y'all know what it looks like, because I don't want to explain it. But they put it behind the courthouse, which was at that time right behind the jail, which allowed the prisoners to look upon this woman, this magnificent cast statue. But the sad thing about it, on top of all that, they decided they couldn't keep it there because they were making terrible remarks about it and talking filth. So they picked it up and they put it right in the middle of Haney Circle. Now, if you look at Haney Circle and you see that statue, you'll see that she is holding in her hand a cask of wine with grapes spilling forth. I would imagine that Cynthia S.B. Haney must be really twisting around in her grave if she knew that was there. Anyway, I've got to tell you one more story. On her 88th birthday, Bert Kruger took her up in his airship. And she loved it so much, she says she's going up again when she turns 90. Another settler who came was a man by the name of Benjamin Mulford. Now, he originally bought the land that that a railroad flagstop was on. It was called Alicia, the flagstop. It was named in honor of Henry Flagler's second wife, Alice. Well, Mulford turned around and named the town after himself and the railroad stop. But there was a woman passenger once that was let off the train in Mulford instead of Fulford, which was near Fort Lauderdale. And getting off the train in the middle of the night, she was attacked by giant mosquitoes and sandflies. So she sued the railroad. Now, the railroad authorities told Mr. Mulford he'd better change the name of the town or they would discontinue train service. So according to legend, it was changed to Salerno, after some Italian sailors on leave said it reminded them of Salerno, Italy. However, there's another story that says that Mr. Mulford had dreamed of making that area the Salerno of America. Now, Hope Sound, right where we are today, was not named after any settler, but it did have a very interesting beginning. It was originally part of what I call a complex. I don't know what you would call it. It was built south of Stuart. It included a little town called Gomez, and Picture City, and Olympia, and Hope Sound. Now, Picture City was going to be the home. It was going to be the Hollywood, California, Florida. I mean, all the movie stars were going to come down. Mr. Selznick, I believe, came down originally to see it, to map it out. And it was to be, you know, just the most wonderful thing in the world. We would have all been movie stars. And Gomez was to be the place where all these stars were going to live, as well as Olympia. Actually, the center of Olympia was right where the Hope Sound baseball field is. So if you ever want to go by there, you can look and see where Gomez was. Well, the plans were very good, but the timing was bad, and all that remains of Gomez and Picture City are some old sidewalks here and some early street lamps. And all the names eventually became synonymous, and now Hope Sound stands alone, gallantly reminding us of what might have been. Also, when I think of Hope Sound, it reminds me of the infamous Ashley gang, because that's where they headquartered. Now, John Ashley was the ringleader, and in 1915, he and his gang attempted a train robbery. Now, the Stuart Times carried a headline, a story of a daring train robbery. John Ashley and his gang made the front page of their hometown newspaper, but they were not very successful as train robbers. While they were trying to rob a lady, she escaped and ran screaming through the train. Well, a quick-thinking porter locked the doors to the next cars, so the robbers couldn't get in and couldn't get out. So they left as they could. They broke out. They were able to break out. And a week later, the local paper had another headline. It said, "A very bold robbery." Now, the Ashley gang, who had failed as train robbers, decided it would be easy to get some money by robbing their hometown bank. So they took the Stuart Bank for $4,500. Now, that was a lot of money in those days. And then they escaped, firing their pistols at anyone who happened to be in their way. They were, we were famous. This little community was famous for being the headquarters of the Ashley gang. But you see, the Ashley gang, they were the topic of every conversation in those days. It didn't make any difference whether you lived in Stuart or Palm City or wherever. The businessmen and the bankers were afraid that they might be the target for the next robbery. And the people who knew the Ashley gang, well, they found them friendly and hospitable, especially to anyone who was in trouble. John, they said, was real good-hearted, a regular Robin Hood. Why, he'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. And their children, all 9 of them, along with their grandchildren, were just as courteous as they could be. Now, that's what they said. I didn't know them personally, so you can't prove it by me. But for some people who did know them, it was hard to understand how the Ashleys, on one hand, could be just as good as they could be, and on the other hand, so evil. Now, anytime John was in jail, one of the other gang members would serve as its leader. So it never stopped. I mean, you know, they were always on our minds, even if he wasn't around. During one of those times, Hanford Mobley, who was John's 18-year-old nephew. Oh, let me stop for a moment and tell you about Hanford. I always thought his participation in the robberies could be blamed on his Uncle John. He was very influenced by his Uncle John, and he adored him. Hanford went to high school right here in Martin County. He was very well liked by his classmates and his teachers. He often drove the family's Model T to school. And the highlight of the school day was to be asked to be one of the 10 or so who could pile into the car on the lunch hour and cruise down the main street of Stuart. And so it just didn't make sense that he, along with 2 other members of the gang, would rob the Stuart Bank a second time. Hanford Mobley dressed himself up as a woman. He walked into the bank wearing a black skirt, a white shirtwaist, and a large black hat with a veil, which he draped partly over his face. Of course, everyone knew who he was. He even wore ladies' shoes and stockings and carried a handbag. Well, they went in and they opened the cash drawers and they took out all the money and they ran out the door, jumped on the running boards of their car, and drove off. Now, through the years, the gang committed more and more murders and more robberies. But as time went on, many of the Ashleys died either in shootouts or some of them were lost in sea, until finally John Ashley and his gang met the end of their crime trail up at the Sebastian Bridge. That happened because his gun moll, his girlfriend, by the name of Flora Frazier. Well, you know what they say about a woman scorned. Well, she ratted on him, as the saying goes. Well, ever since then, things have been, for the most part, quiet and peaceful. Well, I tell you, I always like to save the best for last, and that's what I've done. And the best in my mind was, and always will be, a very wonderful young man by the name of Harry Armstrong Dyer. Harry was 18 years old when he came to Stuart to help raise pineapples on his brother Will's homestead. Now, when Harry reached his legal age of 21, he paced off the land that he wanted for his homestead over on the north shore of the river around Palm City, 152 acres. It's actually on the west shore, the northwest shore. Now, he took those 152 acres and he set out his pineapples, and then he bought some more land on the east shore and set out even more pineapple fields right next to the Frazier homestead. I fell in love with Harry Armstrong Dyer the moment I met him. I guess you could say we both became Twitter-pated. We were married on June 24th, 1897, and 2 years later we had our first daughter, Florence. 2 years passed and Myrtle was born, and a third daughter, Hazel, arrived 3 years after Myrtle. At the time, we were living in a very small house in Stuart, but with 3 daughters, we needed more room, so we bought a 10-acre tract from Mr. Hubert Vesey, and we built this beautiful house overlooking the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. It was built to my specifications. Then we had 2 more children, a son, Harry F. Dyer, who, by the way, is in law school and will be graduating very soon. He's a very smart boy. I'm not bragging, but I think he'll go far. Who knows, maybe someday he'll become judge right here. And last, but certainly not least, our beautiful baby daughter, Virginia. Now, around the turn of the century, the pineapple crops began to ease off, so Harry joined the staff of Armour Fertilizer Company as sales manager. That was just right over the river as well. My husband could charm the bark off a tree, so he didn't have any troubles charming the roughest buyer on his sales route. From Monday to Friday, he'd travel around on the back of a horse by the name of Dick. Now, Dick had a mind of his own. If the pair was destined for Miami and Dick decided not to go, he'd roll over, rider, saddle, and all, and wouldn't move. Now, if he wanted to explore the Miami River, and all the coaxing Harry could do wouldn't convince Dick to come back home. If the children were on him riding along, he was very gentle with the children, but if he was tired and he wanted to eat, he would go right in the barn door and just bend down, so the children just slid right off his back. He was a genius of a horse. But only a man with Harry's sense of humor and personality could endure the shenanigans of that silly horse. So after Armour replaced Dick with, of all things, a motorcycle, we bought the old horse and he became part of the family. In fact, my husband purchased a fine buggy so Dick could provide transportation for the whole family, making it easier for us to get around. Although I have to say the Dyers never had a problem getting around. In fact, we've always been very active. We've always tried to give back as much as we could to this community that we love so much. Harry was Stuart's 3rd mayor, served on the town council before that. My children have been active, as have I. But Harry was the one, and he was always looking forward to something new and adventurous to do. I suppose that's why I wasn't surprised. One day in 1914, he said to me, "You know, Flora, I have an idea. I think I'll open a business in downtown Stuart." Well, that idea became Dyer's Dry Goods Store. It's still there. Sign's still there. You can see it. It's right on the corner of Bellflora and Avenue and 4th. There have been some changes, though, I tell you. You see, Harry was not a well man. Throughout his life, he battled tuberculosis. And in his later years, he's had to spend a great deal of time, many months at a time, in sanitariums out in New Mexico. Now, when he was unable to mind the store, our daughter Myrtle, who decided after she graduated that she didn't want to be a chiropractor after all, became the store manager. And then Florence, who had been married to Earl Ricku, would come in to help when she could. And we hired Mr. Allen to help out, which he did when he wasn't singing in his barbershop quartet. He had a beautiful voice. We loved to have him in the store. And then I would come in of an evening, and I always brought Virginia with me because she loved sleeping under the counters. And then finally, when she could, Myrtle bought the store, and it was hers. Now, throughout the years, my husband's illnesses and frequent absences have left the responsibility of our home and our children, and many times the store, in my hands. So I learned early that I had better become self-sufficient. Perhaps more self-sufficient than I normally would have been or thought I could ever be. After Harry went to work for the Armour Fertilizer Company, I handled what was left of the pineapple growing operation. I would travel by horseback, regularly checking on our pineapples. Now, I had never been on a horse in my life prior to that time. And during the summer harvest, I would work in the packing houses. And later, when we began to use motor launches instead of sailboats, I had to learn not only to operate the launches, but also how to make the adjustments and repairs that were needed just to keep them running. There isn't a motor that I can't fix. Now, I don't want you to think for 1 minute that Harry didn't do his share. He did more than his share. every single weekend when he was able to and was working, and every time he could. You know, sometimes I find it difficult to talk about myself. I suppose it's because I remember my mother always saying, never blow your own horn. In other words, don't start bragging about yourself. But I am simply telling you a story. And that story includes my life. And I'm proud of everything that I have been able to accomplish. So, that said, I will continue on with my story. I never had a formal education, not in the true sense of the word. But I do have a God-given natural talent for many things. As I told you, I had few piano lessons when I was young, but I ended up teaching myself how to play, and I played many more than a few songs. Now, when you love the sound of a violin playing, you want to learn how to play those notes yourself. So I bought a violin, and I taught myself how to play. I am an accomplished violinist. It's not an instrument that is easy to master, but I have done just that. I am an artist. The walls of my home are filled with oil paintings, the sun over the St. Lucie River, the brilliant flowers around my home, and the portraits of my children. I am so blessed to be able to express myself, to bare my soul through my work. Just think how much more I could have accomplished had I had the training. I can knit, I can crochet, I am an expert seamstress, I've made all our clothing for a long time. But you know what I was always fascinated with, after my first 3 children were born especially, or before actually, and that was photography. I decided after my first 3 children were born that I would become a photographer. First of all, it was just too far to go up to Titusville just to have their pictures taken. So I taught myself how to do it. And then I would take photographs of my children all through their childhoods. I turned one of my closets into a darkroom, and I would develop my own film in there. And then one of my friends said to me, Flora, we could sure use a good photographer right here in Stuart. So I became a commercial photographer. I opened a studio over the store. And I see a lady back there shaking and nodding her head, so I'm sure that you must have been one of the 2/3 of the people here in Stuart that I took a picture of. I bet it's true, or you have one in your home. Well, after that, I began to grow roses. It was my last, and I think my best business venture. I called it Virginia Gardens after my youngest child, and the roses I grew were not your everyday backyard roses, not at all, no siree. I grew the most magnificent roses you ever saw. To begin with, I sent away to Texas for some cuttings, and from then on I was able to grow my own. Then twice a week I would pick them, pack them up, and take them down to the train station and send them off to Palm Beach in Miami. And then they would end up in somebody's bouquet, some lovely lady's bouquet or corsage. And after that, I retired. And you know what I do now? Just sit here on my porch and I rock. And I listen to all the sounds of the birds and the river and the wind whispering through the trees and my grandchildren's laughter, and I smile. I'm very content. I have led a very interesting, a very productive life here on the beautiful South Fork of the St. Lucie River. I've done my job. Now it's up to you. You're the future of Martin County. Be sure you take good care of it.